But Dostoevsky said the problem with Marxism is not economic. We know that is a problem, but he said the problem with Marxism is atheism. The government has to become God. And that's what our government has become to far too many people.
Keeping our republic is on the line, and it requires patriots with great passion, dedication, and eternal vigilance to preserve our freedoms. Jenny Beth Martin is the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. She is an author, a filmmaker, and one of Time Magazine's most influential people in the world. But the title she is most proud of is mom to her boy-girl twins. She has been at the forefront, fighting to protect America's core principles for more than a decade. Welcome to the Jenny Beth Show.
And continuing with our series celebrating 15 years of the modern Tea Party movement, it is an absolute honor to introduce my next guest. When he served in Congress, he was the only one that no matter what, would always stand up for what he believed was right, even if it meant he was standing alone. I've rarely met people in my lifetime with this kind of courage and conviction. I would also say that if it weren't for him, we wouldn't currently have a movement conservative as Speaker of the House. Back in 2013, he was the first one to stand up to Republican leadership and say it was time to move on from John Boehner. He was vocally opposed to Paul Ryan as Speaker before anyone else. He has a heart for this country the size of his home state of Texas. Please welcome my good friend, the Honorable Louie Gohmert. I am just so excited to do this interview with you and to talk about things that we've done over the years, and then to make sure people know some of the things that I know about you that they may not know. You and I got to know each other as we were fighting Obamacare back in 2009 and 10 and 11, 12, 13. It seems to go on forever because
we were supposed to repeal it after that too.
Right. And thanks to McCain, that never happened.
Actually, it's more thanks to Boehner and
well, you can elaborate on that.
Yeah.
and we opposed speakers of the House and wanted replacements and improvements in speakers of the House. And right now, I think we've got a much better speaker than anything during the time that you were in Congress. And I want to talk about some of that. One of the things, speaking of the speaker race, is we were watching the votes go on the speaker race in January of 2023, as they went through so many rounds before they finally did approve McCarthy. I was thinking, part of the reason they are so successful right now is because the last names of the people opposing it start with B. So you had Biggs and you had Bishop and you had these people early in the alphabet opposing it. And I think that because you had so much courage early in the roll call count, by others were willing to. It does make a difference. Isn't that crazy? That is crazy.
Well, it's actually going back to 2009 and 10. It appeared we had a decent shot at getting the majority back in November 2010, not because of anything Republicans had done, as under Minority Leader Boehner, we hadn't done much good. And our conference chair was Mike Pence. And anyway, we just hadn't really done as a group what we should have. Some of us were standing up, but it wasn't a majority. But we got the majority back because Obamacare was passed in 2010, and that was when you guys got active, actually before it passed, and we had a good shot at stopping it, even though we were in the minority. There were Democrats that were really nervous about voting for it. But actually, we had a chance of stopping it. The minority party gets to submit a motion to recommit and ask that something be added. And there had been the Hispanic caucus that heard we were going to be pushing an amendment or motion to recommit that Obamacare could not be utilized by people that were here in the country illegally. And the Hispanic caucus took the position that we're not going to vote for it if that's part of the bill. And so that amendment, that motion to recommit, had a good chance of passing because there were some Democrats that were probably going to have to vote for it to keep their seats. And Boehner decides, back in those days, he was the minority leader, what we would submit as a motion to recommit. And he chose between that, he chose another alternative that was a motion to recommit to include tort reform. Well, none of the Democrats had any problem voting against tort reform because the plaintiffs' lawyers were their biggest group of donors. And so afterwards, a couple of us were sitting on the floor, and one of the Democrats, a friend, walked by and said, well, you must be feeling pretty happy now. And he said, well, we were really worried there before we found out what the motion to recommit was. We thought you were going to go a different way, and we weren't sure that we would pass it. But I'd heard Boehner say before, the best thing that could happen for us Republicans politically is if Obamacare passed in the House and didn't pass in the Senate, because we'd get the majority back. And so it appeared clear to me that Boehner and some of the establishment were not serious about stopping Obamacare. Anyway, very sad for America. Also in 2010, there were a group of us that started meeting once a week to talk about who we could come up with that would be a better speaker than John Boehner. And every time we came up with somebody we thought could beat him, somebody from our group would talk to that person and they would say, hey, I'm going to be chairman of this, that, or the other. Boehner already promised me, and I don't think anybody's going to beat Boehner. So if you nominate me, I'm going to stand up and immediately withdraw my name. Well, by September, I guess by the end of September, there wasn't anybody that was willing to be nominated that had a chance. It was just really tragic. So in our first conference, Republican members of the House, and it included the newly elected guys, the biggest conservative wave in the House of Representatives, in 70, 80 years, something like that. And I was so frustrated. I didn't even have a second for anybody. And the night before, I had been trying to think, who could I nominate? And in fact, I texted Mark Levin and I said, hey, there's nobody in the House that has a chance that I could nominate for Speaker. And you remember, you don't have to be a member of Congress to be elected Speaker. And he shot back Scott Walker. And I said, I thought about that, but people are saying if you pull Scott Walker now out of being governor before he finishes doing the things he's trying to do there in his state, then that will all be for nothing. They don't want to lose him, and he won't walk away. So I finally that night thought, So I texted Newt Gingrich and said, hey, I'd like to nominate you tomorrow for Speaker. And I mean, immediately his answer came back, that's impractical. And my reaction was, oh, thank you. He didn't say no. So the next day, I'm sitting on the aisle about 2/3 of the way back, and there wasn't a second. And here we have all these 70, 80 new members, and they're sitting there listening to speeches that Boehner is the best thing since sliced bread. He's the sole reason we got the majority back. If he were in the Senate, the Senate would have gotten their majority back. We owe everything to Boehner. And I'm seeing these guys, the new guys, they're all taking all this in.
Right.
Wow, this guy's more impressive than we thought. And so a nominating speech, you got 3 minutes. And I'm sitting there seeing these guys taking it all in. And I thought, well, I was going, Lord, should I just keep my seat? And when the final speech for Boehner finished, and our conference chair said, are there any other nominations? I jumped up and I'm heading down. But he said, are there any other nominations? Hearing none. I said, Mr. Chairman. And he looked at me with a sad look and went, like I could see in his face, oh, please don't do this. Please don't do this. And I said, I have a nomination. And in my head, I'm thinking, if I say Newt Gingrich's name early on, people will quit listening to me. But I've got 3, and I might get 3.5 before they yank me off, to tell about all the things Boehner promised that were lies. Didn't happen, broke his word over and over. And all these new guys, they don't know.
Right.
But if I can lay this stuff out, then as promises are broken, instead of them going, well, that's strange, Boehner's supposed to be the best thing since sliced bread, maybe this is just uncharacteristic. But if I lay out broken promises over the years that he'd been there, then as he broke more promises, they go, that's just what Louie said. So I got up and I started going through broken promises by Boehner, and I pointed out he didn't get us the majority. And in fact, if you will go look at the polling, people are not more trusting of us than they were before. They're just less trusting of Democrats. It's Obamacare that gave us the majority, and they expect us to do something about it. But it wasn't Boehner. And so I laid all that stuff out. And then finally I said, okay, you don't have to be a member of Congress. Some of you are not aware, but you don't have to be Speaker. And we have a guy that did a great job as Speaker, got us the first majority back in 40 years. And he made some mistakes, but he's learned from them. And I think he'd be a great leader for our party. I nominate Newt Gingrich. Now, I don't have a second, but I need one of you guys. You don't even have to stand up and give a speech. Just say, I second. And then 5 of us need to require a secret ballot. And then we can have a real election for Speaker. So would somebody just say, I second? And it not only was quiet, nobody moved. Everybody just froze. And some of the guys told me later, I was afraid it was like an auction. If I scratched my nose, there's a second right there. No. So anyway, so nobody moved, nobody seconded. And finally, the conference chair said it dies for a lack of a second. But Thomas Massey was new. He was part of that group. And he told me a year or so later, he said, I was sitting there and you gave that speech and nominated Newt. I leaned over to the freshman next to me and said, this has got to be the craziest guy in all of Congress. But he said within 6 months, I was saying, this guy's the smartest guy in Congress. But they saw. And so we came very close to having the 18 that it appeared we needed if everybody had been there and voted to vote him out in January 2013.
Right.
Or to at least freeze the vote like happened last year. And we had 21, but Boehner got to 4 of them and got them to switch. And then once he got us below 18, we still could have done it. I saw in Ken Buck's book that he said, he would have voted to oust Boehner, but it was a lost cause. If he had told us he was going to vote with us, we would have had 18. But we had 17. And then once it was clear we weren't going to get to 18. There were some that just went ahead and voted for him just so they'd have a shot at the chairmanship, something like that. So those are the kind of battles we've been fighting over the years. Yeah.
And then in 2011, you were the only one. In 2013, there were people who voted against him. So it went from one to more than one. And
I think there were about 14 that ended up voting for somebody other than Boehner. Yeah.
And Tim Huelskamp was one of those, right? And then he wound up losing a committee.
Well, 2015 is when we needed 28 or 29, I think, if everybody were there and voting. And we had way more than 29 commit that they would vote for somebody other than Boehner. And anyway, Tim actually was keeping track of the votes, and somebody in the balcony got a view of his keeping track. But yeah, and it ended up costing Tim.
They punished him and cost him his seat. And that's right. What we're referring to is he had an iPad, I think, and he had his whip count of the people he thought who were with him
had a shot.
And what he didn't realize is that while he was holding that, or maybe it was a sheet of paper, I thought it was an iPad.
No, it was an iPad.
One of the reporters from the gallery zoomed in on it and took a photograph of it and then blasted it out everywhere. Then later in 2015, Mark Meadows did the motion. He did the motion to vacate then, and
Thomas Massey actually prepared the motion to vacate the chair, and Mark asked if he could file it. It took a lot of courage for Mark. I was not part of the Freedom Caucus. Most of the guys in the Freedom Caucus at that time had voted for Boehner,
right?
And in fact, he was threatened that if you file this motion to vacate the chair, we're going to throw you out. And anyway, it took courage, but Mark told Thomas he would file it, and he did.
And when he filed it that evening, he called me and told me that he had done it. And because we watched in 2010, and our organization did a freshman orientation. That idea came about because of you. And probably if the freshmen knew it.
Do you remember that orientation you scheduled? Because we realized we've got to get to these freshmen, because the speaker sets the orientation for the new members, as you remember. And they just, I remember my orientation. It seemed like the thing I heard more than any other line was, the best thing you can do for your country is get reelected. And the first time it was said, I'm thinking, And then later on, I'm going, no, there are times you have to stand up for what's right, even if you're concerned it might cost you the election. You do what's best for the country. And anyway, that started bothering me, but we realized we need to start briefing these new freshmen. So you set up an orientation. I think it was going to start on Tuesday or Wednesday, and you're going to do it and have like a day and a half, seemed like, before the official orientation. And as you will recall, Boehner found out, and he moved the orientation back so that, and then you moved it back, and then he moved his back again. And so you set up, the only time was Sunday afternoon.
Yep.
And Sunday evening, and he set up an event for the freshmen that they needed to be at for Sunday afternoon. And we only got a handful.
Yeah, we only had a handful. And you told
And we didn't have them long enough to do a real orientation.
No, it wound up just being basically a luncheon.
Boehner again.
That's when I realized, and it happened so quickly, but that's when I realized the fight really is going to be within the Republican Party, not the Democrat Party. Like, we were fighting Obamacare, And it was easy for them to vote against Obamacare en bloc because they were the minority. But I realized that getting anything done was going to be very hard. I didn't know how hard, but I began realizing it. And you told me, and Kevin, who works with me, while we were at the Glenn Beck event in front of the Lincoln Memorial, you said, you've got to do this orientation. Their orientation is where they really just co-opt them. I was so proud of you
and Kevin and folks that made that happen. That was going to materially make a difference. And at times I've wondered if, maybe Boehner was a little bit like King Saul, not that he's a great warrior like Saul was, but he was really good at spotting people that were a threat to his position, whether to defeat him or to,
right.
And he would co-opt them. And that's what happened 90% of the time. He would co-opt them and get them to come alongside of him. And then if he couldn't co-opt you, then he would try to destroy you or get you defeated like Tim Huelskamp.
Right. And in 2010, while campaigning was still going on, my co-founder, Mark Meckler, went on Neil Cavuto's show. And Neil Cavuto pressed him on whether he thought Boehner should be speaker or not. And finally, and we hadn't taken really an official stance on it, I don't think, as an organization, but finally he just said, no, I don't think it should be Boehner. And he finishes that interview, and less than an hour later, Boehner's office called and canceled a tour, which now knowing what I know about Capitol tours, he should be a little bit thankful, but he canceled a tour for Mark's kids on like a couple of weeks later, because we did our election night party in Washington, D.C., and they were going to be in town. They canceled it and wouldn't do the tour for his kids. Like they're vicious and petty at the same time. Like,
yeah. Well, very petty.
You say that, then no, your kids can't have a tour of the Capitol.
Yeah.
We should have had a tour with you, but.
And can I explain about the Senate vote with McCain?
Yes.
The bill that was created in the House initially, it wasn't going to get rid of Obamacare. It wasn't. And Paul Ryan had to know that. But they were telling President Trump, yeah, this will get rid of Obamacare. But I read it, and it didn't. And it helps that I'd been a litigator, federal, state court, been a district judge, been a chief justice before coming to Congress, reading things. I'm reading this and going, this doesn't repeal it. It's going to cement it and make it hard to ever get rid of it. And so that was a real battle, but they came up with an alternative that passed in the House, and it wasn't great. It was a little better. But the Senate had a bill that was terrible. And this is the only time in my 18 years in Congress, I had senators calling me saying, we're being told if we will vote for this bill, then it will go to conference with the House bill. But our bill is so bad, can you promise me that the House will not just pick up our Senate bill and pass it as is? And I said, no, I can definitely tell you there are not the votes in the House to pass the Senate bill. But they said, well, we can vote for it if we're certain it'll go to conference and it'll undergo some fixes. And McCain, I talked to President Trump about it later. McCain had said he would vote for it. The problem was not so much that he came in and did a thumbs down. It's that he had assured President Trump that he would vote for it. They had some other senators that said they were going to vote against it, but if he just needed one vote, they would go ahead and vote. And he said they had at least 3 people. Just let them know we need your vote, and then they would have changed their vote. So it wasn't just that McCain came in and voted thumbs down, no. It was that he did it at the very last minute, so they didn't have time to get with any other senators to get them to change their vote. So he killed that, so there was no chance of any bill getting done.
It just one of the worst things I can think of. I mean, the way that he did it was wrong, and the fact that he was okay with leaving Obamacare in place was wrong, and it just shows he never, ever was a conservative. And yet there were those of us, I was one of them in 2008, once he became the nominee, trying to help get him elected. And he just pushed us all aside. He couldn't care about anyone who had previously given him any support. He just awful.
Well, he and I had a public discourse, as I had said, after the largest peaceful uprising in the history of the world. Some believe it was around 30 million Egyptians, 90 million in Egypt, 30 million came out in the streets to protest against Morsi, a Muslim brother who was president, who was discarding their constitution. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood started some violence there to try to make it look like it was the peaceful folks. But he flew over there with Lindsey Graham and had a press conference saying they needed to put Morsi back after he was removed. And I made a comment about what poor judgment that was. And then I got hit up, hey, how do you respond to McCain? He said that you were a man of no intelligence. And I said, well, I'll have to see or hear him personally, what he said. Well, it turns out that's what he said. Louie Gohmert's a man of no intelligence. I thought maybe he said I hadn't had the intelligence briefing or something. So then I made the comment that to the fact he didn't know what he was talking about, but if I was a man of no intelligence, then maybe he could do with a little less so that he could have some common sense, something like that. And then I said, I just wish these numbnuts that are criticizing what happened in Egypt, it was a great, wonderful, glorious thing, that they would, be more understanding, something like that. And then I got, I think it was Stephen Bannon asked me on the radio, so the media is saying you called McCain a numbnuts. And I said, well, I really didn't. And he said, well, do you have an apology? And I said, yes. I should never have used the word numb. Because I don't know, that's too personal. But anyway,
he just
anyway,
it's just very frustrating.
And I don't mean to speak ill of those that are gone, but it's what happened, and there's no use trying to rewrite history after it's done.
And we can't rewrite that. And he did what he did, and we're all worse off because of it.
And the federal government is the repository for medical records, and they look at people's bank records. We know the FBI has done a good bit of that without proper warrant, without probable cause. And I said back in 2010, when Obamacare was going on, someday with the federal government, they've got your banking records, they've got your medical records. You'll get, because of Obamacare, you'll get a letter from the federal government saying, we noticed your cholesterol rate is very high, and we noticed you bought a pound of bacon the other day at the grocery store. So we're going to be raising the cost of your health care because you're being irresponsible. That's what you get when you have an Orwellian government, and that's where this has been heading. And I've got to say this for President Obama. He said he would fundamentally transform America, and he really did.
Yeah, he did. He
Not
did.
for the better.
No.
Unless you're a big fan of totalitarian, Marxist, Orwellian type governments.
And people who are fans of that don't actually understand what it's really like.
Well, and we see billionaires giving away, get so much money to try to make this socialist, really Marxist, totalitarian, trying to make that all happen. And obviously, they're brilliant when it comes to making billions of dollars, but they're not very smart. Apparently, they didn't get enough history to know that if we become a Marxist nation, the first thing that happens, they take all of their money. They don't even say thank you. They take all of their money and they either kill them or send them to a gulag, to a prison. So they're not smart enough to realize that. They think they'll be part of that tiny little elite ruling class, and that's not the way it works once they take over.
No, because the people who are tyrannical and who want to soak up all that power, they find ways.
Yeah.
They're not going to allow others who might have power to threaten their power.
Well, look at Putin. It's
Right.
exactly what he did.
Right.
And when some oligarch with a lot of money, he thinks they may be a threat to him, will they disappear or end up dead? They fall off buildings or, take poison accidentally or something like that.
Let's go back for a minute to the speaker race. So you had 2011, we talked about 13, then there was 15, and ultimately we wound up not having Boehner, not having McCarthy. We defeated McCarthy during that time, and then we wound up with Paul Ryan. And then you fast
Boehner's choice, by the way.
Right.
Some of us were pushing. I thought Daniel Webster, he doesn't vote as conservatively as I did, but Daniel's a good man, first speaker in Florida's legislature since Reconstruction. And he was going to be giving the power back to members of Congress that had all been sucked up by the speaker, which is what had happened in January of 23, when I think there were 18, something like that, 16, that said no until the speaker agrees to give power back to the committees and members. We're not voting for them. And they held it up. There were 8 votes where they wouldn't vote, and they were getting cussed at, all kinds of things. But by the 9th vote, the speaker agreed to give power back to the committees and the members. They could make their own decisions without having the speaker's approval. But then ever since 23, I guess 100 years later, that power had gone right back to the speaker. And you could tell even Kevin McCarthy was not interested in having power go back. And a great indication of that was every Republican and most of the Democrats knew that what the chief of the Capitol Police told us was true, that there was no evidence from any source that any member of Congress was a threat to another member, yet she put up metal detectors.
Right.
Why? For the optics, to make it look like, oh no, there's all kinds of fear. Well, there was no threat of any member to another member. They didn't need the metal detectors. And so they didn't have one at the speaker's lobby, and there's a restroom right there. And I'd done it before since the metal detectors were put up around the other entrances. Pelosi did it the day I did, came in without being wanded. So I go to the restroom. They watched me go in. It wasn't like, The Godfather where somebody put a gun in the toilet tank. There are no toilet tanks, and they inspect the restrooms. And so I went out, came back in. I'd already been through the metal detector, but I got hit with a $5,000 fine. There were a couple other guys that got hit with fines too, Andrew Clyde. But his was intentional, and he was wanting to show that this is illegal, unjustified, unconstitutional. Well, everybody figured that once we got the majority back, Kevin would not only get rid of the metal detectors, but he would also say, and we're not doing fines. Violates the 27th Amendment, violates this, that, and the other. Was no evidence it was needed. Kevin did not want to take that position to say these guys should not have been fined, because he liked the idea of the speaker having that kind of power to do whatever he wanted. So he didn't join with us to get rid of the fines.
Are they still there today?
Yeah, Ken Cuccinelli is our lawyer, and the court, it's going up on appeal that the trial court dismissed, but so it's still on appeal, but it would have all gone away if Kevin or if Mike now said, you know what, it's moot because those fines should never have been imposed. Metal detector shouldn't have been there.
And I wonder if anyone has even mentioned it to Speaker Johnson.
I texted Andrew Clyde. Was going to try to meet with him and talk about it, but we'll see.
We should see on that and see if anything can be done. I do know that what happened in January of 2023, and then what happened in September of 2023, when they ultimately did get rid of McCarthy, it wouldn't have happened. It may not have happened had you not done what you did in 2011.
Well, that's what some of the guys, they were trying to make me feel good, but some of the guys that were making that happen said, you laid the groundwork for this.
You did lay the groundwork for it. And because of what you did, they learned from what you did in 2011 and 2013. Then in 2015, they learned lessons from 2013, and the same thing in 2015. And it took
by 2015, that for the first time in the history of Congress, there were actually formal nominations for others, but that had never happened before. And one of our group, and it may have been Massey, but somebody went to the parliamentarian, because we had talked about it. After the Democrats nominate a candidate for speaker, the Republicans nominate a candidate for speaker, then the speaker pro tem asks, are there any other nominations? So apparently there's no rule against nominating others. The parliamentarian said, well, yeah, but nobody's ever done it. But so in the past, we would vote for other people, which you could do, but nobody had been formally nominated. And so Steve King and Daniel Webster was part of it, a number, but the idea was to nominate other people. And some people, the left still reports, Gohmert thought he could beat Boehner and he got 3 votes and one of those was his. There was one article that was published in Washington that had it right. My goal was to get 29 people to vote for anybody but Boehner. It has to be a person living. It can't be Mickey Mouse or something like that, or Mickey Mantle had passed away. Because people had thought about that, but no, it had to be a living person. And if we could get enough so that he couldn't get it, then we would ask for an emergency conference, and then we would get cussed at the conference. And we'd say, fine, say what you want, but we're not changing our vote until we agree on a compromise candidate. So that was the goal in 2013 and 2013 and then 2015. But we got close. But when we got 24, Boehner knew his days were numbered.
Right.
Yeah. And because we were so close, and the first promise he broke, like Kevin did, it was going to be over.
And because we had helped, and I had communicated with you so much in 2011
we were
and
in
2013 and
contact,
15 and 17. And then when 2023 happened and people were going, well, what's their end game? They don't have a plan. I said, they do. Actually, right now, their plan is to change the rules. That's what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
This is how they're going to be able to change the rules.
Get the power back to members.
It takes this kind of action for them to get the rules changed.
I was surprised at some of the people that did not understand that.
I was too, and some of them who you actually have been communicating with in previous speaker fights.
And they knew.
And then in September, when ultimately the motion to vacate went all the way to the floor and McCarthy is no longer speaker, and then it ultimately moves to be Mike Johnson, well, that's what we had said would play out in 2015 if we'd had enough. So it was not it wasn't a pretty process.
Or 2013, we were so close. Yeah.
In both of those years, so it played out finally in 2023, and it wasn't a pretty process. It wasn't fun.
At all.
It wasn't fun for anyone, but it helped. It helped clean things and show that we're not going to keep doing business as usual.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the majority is just so thin in the House that we're not going to get what I want. But I want to just really highlight the fact that you made a difference with that. And you helped prepare our organization and me to be able to message to everyone, this is what's happening. This is the strategy. I understand what's happening. Let me explain it to you. You don't get it? Let me explain it to you.
Wasn't it 2010 when we said we need help?
Yes.
Can you get a group? And holy cow, you got a group, and they made clear we don't want Obamacare. Those kind of things made a difference and would have stopped it if we had had leadership of any courage at all, or that weren't just sold out establishment.
Right. Now, I think that with talking about the fines and Mike Johnson, we should definitely follow up or have Congressman Clyde follow up. I know that in these first 100 or so days of Mike Johnson being speaker, he's just been drinking out of a fire hose. This may not have even crossed his radar.
Yeah.
So,
see, and I haven't talked to him, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't communicated. I don't know what if anybody has gotten the message to him, but hopefully it will. And I think Andrew is going to try to make that happen.
One of the things that you did while you were congressman that I saw you doing very often, you had a lot of whistleblowers who would go through your office. Well, explain the whistleblower process, and why is it that while you were there, so many wanted to go through your office and they go through Grassley's office so often on the Senate side? What happens with that?
Well, they have to feel like you will protect their identity. And so, like FBI in 21, 22, so many FBI agents were complaining, but they knew if word got out, then they would be toast. So we get a lot of information like that. You do something with it. And of course, the lamestream media will say, oh, well, if you're not giving names, obviously you just made this up. No, I didn't make any of our complaints up. They came from people inside. Fortunately, there's conservative media now that will report those kind of things. But it's tough getting the word out to people that only get their news from left-wing social media or comedy shows that aren't funny, or CNN, MSNBC, where they're not getting the right story.
And when they come forward, there's a formal process that they go through, right?
There is, but what we have seen is if it's a conservative whistleblower and they go through that process, then they are, alienated and run out of their position. It's only if you're a liberal that hates President Trump that you can go through the official whistleblower and, not have adverse consequences, but become a real hero. Unfortunately, if you're conservative, they run you off. They'll make up an excuse to get rid of you.
And we've seen that happen. I interviewed Stephen Friend, who is one of the FBI whistleblowers, and he's no longer with the FBI. Yeah. And the two whistleblowers from the IRS, I think they are still with the IRS, the ones who talked about Hunter Biden. But I watched their testimony, and you could tell they were agonized about coming forward, and they felt like they had to. And one is clearly not a conservative, and it's crazy that it takes so much bravery to just stand up and say, look, the government's being weaponized against people. We need to
specifically with the FBI, and I put this in my little booklet that I emailed or texted Sean Hannity one night. I'm trying to do an expose or an op-ed on Mueller so people understand his background, and you don't have people saying, oh, he's the gold standard like Lindsey Graham had said. They'll understand this guy has a track record that is not good. And so Ted Stevens, U.S. Senator from Alaska, he had improvements to his home, and the contractor at one time, I recall he had said, hey, you're paying too much. And look, they watch me like a hawk because I stand up on stuff, so just cash the check, take the money. Well, the FBI got a hold of the contractor and made him change his story under all kinds of duress and threats. And we've seen this play out in recent few years. They execute a search warrant. They take all of your records. They get all of your bank records. How can you prove anything unless they give you back your records? And they would keep records and not let them have records back. And so they were able to put together a case saying that this contractor made illegal contributions, I think $700,000 or $800,000 allegation, and he was not able to properly defend himself. So he gets convicted a week or two before the election. He only lost by 1,000 to 2,000 votes. They really screwed him over to make sure he didn't go back into office. And after the election, he's out. But one of the two FBI agents that was most involved did an affidavit because the guy had a conscience and said, we got a guy to testify to something he knew wasn't true. We coerced it. We forced it. We didn't allow him to have evidence he should have had. And when the judge found out that they had manufactured this case against Ted Stevens, he threw it out, recommended action against him. Well, the FBI agent's superior that was most involved in fabricating the case against Ted Stevens was moved to a better office, and the FBI agent that had a conscience, he was basically run out of the FBI. He was pulled from having any job and all. It forced him really out. So a true whistleblower like that, a guy with a conscience that understands we got to do right. We're part of the Justice Department, but you can go clear back there to that election, to that prosecution, and see under Mueller things really started changing.
It's just absolutely
It's just
horrible.
gotten worse.
It's just gotten worse.
So much worse.
Well, and they punish the good guys, and there's no accountability for the bad guys. And I learned it firsthand as I dealt with the targeting of the Tea Party Patriots. We were targeted, and our donors were 6 times more likely to be individually audited if they donated to us than the average person. And nothing, there's
all of that came out, but because we had gutless leaders, then it wouldn't allow anything to be done to Lois Lerner or to the director of the IRS.
Right.
Yeah, anybody involved was not punished. Well, she was supposedly punished by being taken off and put on paid leave.
Yeah,
and then got a great job, as I understand it. I'm not sure where it was, but nobody was really punished for that. Yeah. And as a result, it still goes on because we didn't require consequences to the improper conduct.
That's right. That's exactly right. If you allow it to go on, then others think that they can get away with it too. And it gets worse and worse and worse.
And it has.
And that is exactly what has happened.
I'm as of February 1st, I'm senior fellow with the David Horowitz Freedom Center.
Very good.
And the IRS has been after David Horowitz Freedom Center. I mean, his background, David's such a brilliant guy. He was a communist. His mother was a communist. Daddy was a communist. And he eventually, after the plans they had to create chaos for the 68 Democratic Convention, he started going, wait a minute, we're pushing some things that are not good. And anyway, he began to see cracks and then converted. There's nobody that's more of a free market guy. And in fact, one of his recent books, and I know David, and I think the world of him, but I think in his head, his dad and mom are gone, but he still has arguments. But such a simple thing, he said he was shaving, and he looked at his razor, and he has 5 blades in his razor. 5 blades in a razor, and he can push a button and it vibrates. And it's got this, smooth, silky stuff around it to make it more comfortable. And he goes, you would never find this razor in a communist country. And he's right.
Right.
You get 1 blade, you get one. They're not concerned. But in the United States, up until recent times, you're rewarded for coming up with something more innovative, making things better, making them easier. And that's the beauty of having freedom that we have had until the most recent oppressive administration.
You lived for a brief time in a communist country.
Well,
in college,
I was an exchange student for a summer in the Soviet Union.
While it was still the Soviet Union.
Yeah, between my sophomore and junior year at Texas A&M. Yeah, it was the real Soviet Union.
And
it was so wild. Jenny Beth, some of those memories still come back. Some years back, when I heard someone say, hey, these children don't belong to the parents. They belong to the state. They belong to us. Oh, my gosh. So on a tour, nobody called it daycare back then, in the Soviet Union, every mother and dad had a job. And that meant that as soon as the kid could, a matter of weeks, they went to the facility where the state saw to their upbringing and their education. And the director of this daycare center was saying, these children belong to the state. They do not belong to the parents. The parents are temporary caregivers. And she said, and we monitor very, very closely everything the parents tell these children. If they ever say anything inappropriate in a child's presence, we take those children out and they never see them again, and we give them to more deserving parents. And I thought back at the time, I just got chilled. Oh my gosh, thank God I grew up in America. And now I'm seeing that here, people thinking that the government has a more right to the children than their own parents. But I saw a quote recently, Jim Garlow published, from A.A. Hodge, who was the head of the Princeton Seminary. And he was saying nothing would scare him more than the idea of a government-run education where Christian principles are completely ignored. Nothing would bode worse for the country. And I read in the last year or so a book William F. Buckley wrote on God and Man at Princeton. He wrote it a year, I think, after he got out of Princeton. And he was so brilliant, but he makes the point, look, you have a conservative Christian president at Princeton at that time in the 50s. You had a conservative Christian, for the most part, but certainly pro-capitalist president and board of trustees. And in the name of freedom of speech, they kept hiring socialist economic professor, religion professor that was agnostic and made fun of anybody who was Christian. And he points out, yes, we're all for freedom of speech. We're all for freedom of thought. But when you're running an institution, you have every right to hire people of similar thought processes that you have so that you can train people. And my alma mater, Texas A&M, just read a study about how woke they have become and all the different training and classes that aren't preparing people for anything other than being sensitive to LGBTQRS stuff. And you're going, wait, this is supposed to be an institution that prepares people for jobs and whatnot. But Buckley saw it back in the 50s, early 50s. He saw that was going on, and it's still going on. And I think we saw riots and all kinds of trouble in the late 60s, early 70s. And, the Bill Ayers and those folks, they eventually realized we didn't accomplish anything by blowing things up, killing people, stuff. They moved in, got tenure at the universities, started teaching the teachers, and now we have generations that have been taught that socialism, progressivism is a good thing. But Dostoevsky, back in the 19th century, was writing papers disproving the things Marx was saying, because Marx was an idiot. I mean, he didn't foresee unions. He couldn't see a powerful workers' middle class that could decide elections. He couldn't see any of that. So why would anybody follow him? Well, they are. But Dostoevsky said the problem with Marxism is not economic. We know that is a problem, but he said the problem with Marxism is atheism. The government has to become God. And that's what our government has become to far too many people.
It really has. And it fills something in them that they're missing otherwise. And I don't even think they understand that they're missing it. And it's...
Well, that summer I was in the Soviet Union. There were 8 Americans allowed in on that, college students allowed in that summer on this program. And when we got to the part of the city stays, we had a trip out to Zagorsk. At that time, it was the only allowed Christian seminary, Russian Orthodox. And it was a good bit way outside of Moscow. And it was kind of a walled entity, ancient wall, gorgeous cathedral. But there was a building wasn't very tall, but it had a painting of Lenin's face. And above it, it said Lenin in Russian, and below Znami. Lenin is with us. And so we're turning into the gate here at Zagorsk, and the message the government is saying is, you may be going into this little Christian enclave, but remember, it's Lenin who is with us. Well, I'd seen Lenin. He wasn't with us. I've been in his tomb. He wasn't with us.
That's part of why we have to fight right now.
Yeah.
And why it's so important that we continue to stand for liberty and for freedom in America.
Yeah.
And as a college student, being able to see such a stark contrast in what communism was like and what freedom was like. What we're seeing right now with, I think, because the Soviet Union has collapsed and it's gone away now.
We thought that was the end. Everybody could see it doesn't work. And it happened in Venezuela, but still people are saying, well, maybe they just didn't do it right. No.
And now they can't go there and see it the way that it's not like they were letting a lot of people in. There were only 8 Americans who were able to go in. But look at one of the 8, he became a congressman who helped change the Speaker of the House.
Wow.
But
can I say something else about that? There were a couple of different times where people would go rushing off, and I would turn to the Soviet college student. I'm going, what's their problem? And it was explained to me this way: in your country, you can get ahead by working harder and making more money. That gives you more power. In our country, there's not all that much difference between what people make, socialist country. So the only way to get ahead is to step on other people. So we're encouraged to rat out anybody you see doing something inappropriate or that might offend a government official. And that's how you get ahead here. So yes, they'll run tell on me and I'll be hauled away. And that will allow them to have some more privileges, more perks, be recognized. And we're seeing that in America now. People getting ahead, thinking the thing to do is to quash, to step on other people and improve their lot in life.
And it's horrible. And I think that you have the fall of the Soviet Union and Venezuela. You have the socialism and Marxism being taught in schools now instead of critical thinking. You've got critical social justice theory instead of critical thinking. And they come out thinking, oh, socialism isn't so bad, or a little bit of socialism isn't bad. Pure capitalism is bad. Capitalism is bad. And they have no way to actually, they have nothing to compare it to.
They haven't been taught properly.
They haven't been taught. And then they can't go look inside the Soviet Union because it doesn't exist anymore. And they just they think
that's a bad example. No, that's what happens.
It is what happens.
And I've had young people say, look, I know socialism is supposed to be bad, but it really sounds like a Christian idea. Sharing, and everybody sharing and having the same stuff. That sounds like a Christian idea. And I said, it sounds that way, but because no human is perfect, everybody has flaws, jealousy takes over, and you end up having to have a totalitarian government strong enough to take from people doing the work and strong enough to give to people they want to give to. Not you doing charity so that you're blessed and have a wonderful, warm feeling for helping people, but the government. And we're seeing that with the Biden administration. They're rewarding our enemies and making them stronger.
It isn't Christian. Christian would be sharing and voluntary.
voluntarily. Yes.
And what happens when the government forces you to do it is coercion and tyranny.
Yeah.
And that's not sharing voluntarily. It's you're being forced to. And that's not kind. It's trampling on God-given rights.
Yeah. And one of Ayn Rand's books, and I forget which one, but it was about a time when, one of the biggest jobs was making candles because there were no electric lights. And these guys came up, they found out that if you combined some chemicals, it gave off light. And they went and showed it to the wisest people that could do something about it. And it was a better light. It was more consistent. And the reaction of the leaders was, but if we do this and use this, what would the candle makers do? We can't allow this. And that's kind of that socialist mentality. You don't allow people to advance if it causes you to give up any power.
And that's why we fight so hard, to make sure that we're standing against those who seek to hold on to power and to help it expand freedom in America and our own communities and around the world.
Yeah. But the corruption has gotten so widespread in the federal government, so widespread. It's a dangerous time. And that's why the election 2024, I'm afraid if the Democrats win, that political corruption in the FBI, DOJ, Homeland Security, Intel community, DOD, it's there. It's going to be in place, and it won't be any coming back.
And that's why people who are listening right now have to be active this year.
Yeah. And like in Texas, we don't have an attorney general that's going to have people out getting injunctions and stuff against fraud that's found. It's up to the people.
Right.
People have got to do this. And even though there are fewer Republicans per capita in the big cities, that's where we need them the most, to be poll watchers and to be judges, election judges. That we need them involved in reporting things, because this election is too important not to make it really secure.
That's exactly right. And our mantra for the year is secure and win. And that's what we have to do.
Got to.
Well, Louie, thank you so much for being with me.
Jenny Beth, I always love being with you. Thank you.
The Jenny Beth Show is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin, produced by Kevin Mooneyhan, and directed by Luke Livingston. The Jenny Beth Show is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org.
If you like this episode, let me know by hitting the like button or leaving a comment or a 5-star review. And if you want to be the first to know every time we drop a new episode, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for whichever platform you're listening on. If you do these simple things, it will help the podcast grow, and I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much.